It's an interesting question, what you really mean by macroeconomics, because in a sense you could argue that macroeconomics is a sort of term that's specific to a particular methodology, and say complexity economics would see no difference between micro and macroeconomics. So where does macroeconomics stop, if you like?
You're absolutely right. It's one that occasionally comes up in our management team meetings, and I think that the key point is that in the Research Council's initial call, it was actually labelled as understanding the macroeconomy, which is quite a clever way of avoiding, some tricky labels of what is macroeconomics and what is not. What do we mean by the macroeconomy? Well, we mean the whole. Now, that doesn't need to stop at national borders, and in fact, our very first hub was about globalization specifically because we quite clearly don't live in the sort of national borders that are often portrayed in straightforward macroeconomic, in inverted commas, models. In other words, where we have a government that sets interest rates for that country, that defines the currency and the tax base for that country. Well, that's not really true. Even the Bank of England recognise that more than half of the interest rate movements in the UK are influenced by international factors. So those sort of boundaries aren't quite so straightforward today as they perhaps were in the past and have often been in simple macroeconomic models. So the easiest thing I can say that it involves the whole. That shouldn't be taken to mean either at the global level or nation state level, because actually one thing that's been very interesting is about what about the influence of social groups. So in macroeconomics, we've often thought macro is really the aggregate of individuals and bringing together micro. And we often talk about micro foundations, which would typically mean the individual or a firm. Well, what about groups of people in a country? Many of our values and perspectives are made up by our peer groups, and sociologists often talk about groups, how our values are formed, how they change, how we see people as insiders and outsiders. Yet this is really, this sort of meso level has largely been ignored in economics because it's neither macro nor micro, but it clearly is part of what constitutes understanding the macroeconomy and how we, for example, achieve cooperation as a foundation for economic success. So I don't want to sort of try and put it in one box called macro and one box called micro. It's about understanding the macroeconomy.
So it could be that we move to meso-founded macroeconomic understanding.
It could certainly be bringing in what happens, for example, to how our preferences get shaped, that they're not all fixed and intertemporally stable and given, that perhaps they are in fact influenced by groups in society. That's one possible area of future research. So, this was quite prevalent in a debate in the 60s and 70s. On one side you had Albert Hirschman and Amartya Sen, and on the other side you had the Chicago economists. Well, in economics that debate got resolved, but in the real world we see more and more various sections in society becoming perhaps more fractured and losing some of this social cooperation, which is indeed the very foundation of macroeconomics, and of course exactly what Adam Smith wrote in his other book, The Moral Sentiments, which has tended to be forgotten by economists.
So, and I suppose institutional economics have continued with that, haven't they?
Indeed.